Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. Here is what leaders keep getting wrong about AI. It won't fix the parts of your business you never made explicit. It won't repair unclear ownership, messy access, or 5 different versions of the same truth, but it will expose them incredibly fast. If you want more system-level analysis like this, subscribe to the podcast, because what looked like AI transformation in a lot of organizations was actually something else entirely. It was an audit. And once that process starts, the system begins speaking back through the tool. The rollout looked ready from the outside. I've seen this pattern more than once, where from the outside, the organization looked completely ready to move forward. They had a strong Microsoft 365 footprint with Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive all in place, supported by a clean innovation narrative from leadership. The language was all there too, with everyone talking about the modern workplace, productivity uplifts, and responsible AI adoption. On paper, the whole thing looked convincing because licenses were purchased, pilot groups were selected, and internal communications were fully prepared. Champions were identified, and there was visible executive support, which matters because if leadership doesn't signal importance, most new tooling just floats at the edge of the business and never lands in real work. This rollout didn't look like a side project. It looked serious, and people expected to see practical gains almost immediately. They wanted faster meeting summaries and quicker email drafting, hoping to spend less time searching across old files to find what they needed. There was a real desire to see less pressure on overloaded managers who usually have to manually stitch together context from 3 different places before making a call. Honestly, those expectations weren't irrational at all, and that is the part we need to be fair about when we look at these systems. The promise made sense because if you already work inside Microsoft 365 all day, and AI can sit across that environment, the next assumption is that work gets lighter and the organization becomes more responsive. That is the story most leadership teams wanted to believe, and for a short time the story actually held up. Early outputs often look good enough to pass, whether it's a summary here or a draft there that feels useful to the person receiving it. A meeting recap might sound coherent, or a document answer might seem right, and that is exactly why this specific moment is so dangerous for a business. The first signals are often positive enough to confirm the rollout narrative, not because the system is healthy, but because the easiest use cases don't test the infrastructure very hard. Low-risk summarization can hide deep structural weakness for a while, and a neat recap of a meeting doesn't tell you whether your information environment is actually aligned. It just tells you the model can generate language, which is a very different thing from being operationally ready. This is where a lot of organizations confuse access with readiness, thinking that because they have the licenses and the tenant, the tool is successfully in the workflow. From a system perspective, that isn't readiness. It's just availability, and availability is never the same thing as true alignment. The real question was never whether people could open Copilot, but whether Copilot was entering a coherent environment where the underlying information was current and ownership was clear. We have to ask if access reflected actual responsibility and if teams agreed on where the truth lived, but in many cases the answer was a quiet no. That no stayed hidden under years of acceptable dysfunction because humans are incredibly good at compensating for broken systems. We know which folder not to trust and which specific person to ask when we need the real numbers, and we know that the deck in one team site is outdated while the version in someone's email is closer to reality. Even when the org chart says one thing, we know that decision-making really happens somewhere else, so we build invisible workarounds to carry the ambiguity ourselves. The business keeps functioning this way, not efficiently or cleanly, but well enough to get by, and then the AI arrives without inheriting any of that human intuition. It inherits the environment instead, and that changes everything about how the business operates. The moment an AI assistant starts retrieving and synthesizing across your tenant, all the things people were informally compensating for suddenly become operational inputs. Now the old folder and the duplicate file matter, and that inherited permission from a project that ended 3 years ago becomes a liability. What looked mature from the outside often turns out to be structurally vague underneath, which creates the tension at the heart of this whole episode. The rollout looked modern and the leadership language was polished, but underneath that, many businesses were still running on undocumented assumptions and stale content. The issue wasn't that AI arrived too early, but rather that readiness had been defined too loosely by the people in charge. Tool adoption was mistaken for operational maturity, and once that happens, the rollout carries a hidden risk of exposure rather than just simple failure. When the tool starts working across a misaligned environment, it doesn't just produce answers, it reveals the actual shape of the business behind them. Once people begin to see that reality, the conversation changes very quickly, and the system finally starts to show its true face. The first cracks never look like failure. The first signs of a system failing almost never arrive as a dramatic collapse. Instead, they show up as small hesitations, like a summary that feels mostly right but doesn't quite earn your full trust. You might see a draft that saves you time initially, but then it requires more manual correction than you expected to give it. Sometimes it's an answer that sounds polished on the surface while landing a little off for the people who are actually closest to the work. These small moments matter because early disappointment with AI usually doesn't look like a total rejection of the tool. It looks like qualified optimism, where people say things like, "This is useful," or "It's promising for simple things." That last part is the real signal to watch for. When a team says it works for simple things, they are usually talking about low-risk summarization or pulling together obvious context from recent activity. The quality starts to shift the moment a task becomes dependent on business nuance, cross-functional history, or the current ground truth. You can use the same tool, the same person, and even the same prompt structure, but the answer changes based on what the system can actually see. This is where the first real doubt enters the workflow. It's not because the model suddenly became bad, but because people notice that output quality is uneven in ways that map directly to the environment underneath it. One team might get a strong answer because their source material is current and clear, while another team gets something vague because their underlying context is fragmented. This is the point most leaders miss when they read inconsistency as a maturity issue with the AI itself. They assume users need more training or better prompts, and while that might be partly true, that explanation is often way too convenient. If one person gets precision and another gets ambiguity with the same capability, the real variable isn't user confidence, it's the context. Once people feel that inconsistency, their behavior changes quietly rather than loudly. They stop trusting the first answer and start checking source documents, comparing the output against what they already know to be true. They might ask a colleague before they act or open a file manually just to be safe, which means the workflow has changed in a very important way. The friction hasn't disappeared from the process, it has simply moved to a different stage. Before AI, the effort sat in gathering and drafting, but after AI, that effort often shifts entirely into verification. That sounds like a small shift, but it isn't, because when verification becomes mandatory, the promised efficiency starts leaking away. You might save 10 minutes generating an answer, but then you lose 15 minutes making sure it won't embarrass you in front of a client or your boss. From a system perspective, that isn't acceleration, it's structural compensation. The people inside the system are now doing the trust repair work that the system failed to make unnecessary. I remember talking with teams who all said the same thing in different words. They weren't against the tool, they just didn't know when it was safe to rely on it. That uncertainty is expensive because useful AI in business isn't about whether it can produce language. It's about whether people can act on the output without rebuilding their confidence manually every single time. Once that confidence breaks even slightly, adoption starts to weaken at the edges of the organization. You won't see it immediately in the dashboards or executive updates, but you will see it in lived behavior. People use it for low-stakes tasks while avoiding it for anything that carries real decision weight. They let it draft, but they don't let it decide. And that split tells us the system is revealing where context is too unstable for trust. This is why the first cracks never look like failure, because a hard stop or a visible technical incident would be much easier to spot. What happens instead is slower and more important as the organization discovers that AI usefulness is conditional on clean context and shared understanding. Once people start verifying the tool more than they use it, the real question is no longer whether the AI is intelligent. The real question is what exactly it is seeing. Because if the environment is fragmented or outdated, the answer can sound coherent while being structurally wrong. AI is not a transformation tool. Let me take one step back, because this is where the whole AI conversation usually goes wrong for most businesses. Most people still talk about AI as if it is a transformation tool, as if buying access to intelligence automatically changes your operating reality. It doesn't, because AI is not transformation, it is amplification. If the structure underneath your work is strong, AI compresses your effort and speeds up synthesis by reducing the manual drag people have carried for years. In a healthy environment, you ask for context and it gives it to you, which feels impressive because the value was already sitting in the architecture. Clear ownership, current information, and shared patterns for where truth lives make the tool look like a miracle. AI just made those existing advantages more visible and more usable for the team. But if the structure underneath your work is weak, AI will compress that weakness just as quickly. It makes confusion show up faster and makes vague ownership more painful because the answer arrives instantly and forces you to ask if you can trust it. I often say this isn't medicine, it's more like an X-ray that doesn't heal anything but reveals the fractures that were already there. The misalignment and the hidden dependencies were always present, but AI removes the delay between that structural weakness and the operational consequence. This is a very different role from the one most leaders imagine when they treat AI like a rescue layer for an organizational mess. From a system perspective, trying to use AI to compensate for years of unclear design is fragile and unrealistic. If your people are still relying on tribal knowledge and back-channel approvals to find the truth, AI won't stabilize that environment. It will put pressure on it, and while pressure is useful for showing us what can hold, it also shows us what was being held together manually. Tool-centric thinking becomes dangerous because it focuses on which model or which app to use rather than the environment the tool is entering. AI doesn't operate in strategy slides, it operates in actual conditions like file sprawl, role ambiguity, and permissions inherited from forgotten projects. When it enters that environment, it scales whatever is already true, which is the part executives need to understand most. AI doesn't create your business reality, it reveals it at machine speed. If your business has clarity, AI makes that clarity faster, but if your business has drift, AI makes that drift impossible to ignore. If you have no stable source of truth, AI won't invent one for you. It will just confidently assemble fragments and hand them back as if they made sense. Then the people inside the system have to do the expensive part again by interpreting, validating, and correcting the output. That is not transformation. It is acceleration without alignment, and that usually feels productive right up until your decision quality starts to slip. The reason AI creates such mixed results is not because the technology is immature, but because organizations keep asking a diagnostic layer to behave like a repair layer. They want it to fix what it can only expose, and once you understand that, the rollout confusion starts to make sense. The tool is doing exactly what it was designed to do by retrieving and surfacing patterns from what already exists. It's just not designed to clean up years of structural debt on the way in, so the real question is what exactly it will amplify first. What AI amplifies first, data reality. The first thing AI amplifies isn't your strategy, your culture, or how much you've invested in innovation. It amplifies your data reality. This matters because most leadership teams don't actually operate from a place of data reality, but rather from a set of comfortable data assumptions. They assume the right information exists and that the latest version is easy for anyone to find. There is an assumption that important material is stored exactly where it belongs, and that every key document is current, labeled, and understood across different teams. But here's the thing. AI doesn't work from assumptions. It works from what is actually there, what is retrievable, and what is indexed in the system. That is a very different standard for a business to meet. In most organizations, the information estate looks far more organized in a PowerPoint presentation than it does in daily practice. You don't just have documents, you have duplicates, outdated decks, and old project folders that still look official even though they've been dead for years. You have meeting notes that contradict later decisions and versions named Final, Final 2, and Final Approved New, all sitting in the same environment the AI is now expected to interpret. When people complain that a tool gave a strange answer, we need to pause and look closer. A strange answer is often a structural clue because the AI may not be inventing hallucinations from nowhere, but rather blending fragments from everywhere. If everywhere contains drift, duplication, and contradiction, then even the most coherent language will carry weak judgment. This is one of the hardest things for professionals to accept because the output sounds smart and feels finished. It arrives with the kind of confidence that makes a busy person want to move faster, but confidence in tone is not the same as confidence in context. Context quality is always downstream of data quality, and that is the real dependency we have to manage. If the underlying information is fragmented, the answer might read smoothly while landing completely wrong in the room. This doesn't happen because the AI ignored the business, but because the business never made its truth structure clear enough to retrieve reliably. Over time, organizations accumulate informal truth stores where the official version lives in SharePoint, the practical version lives in Teams, and the real decision history lives only in the memory of 3 people who know how to navigate the mess. Humans can survive that environment for a long time because we know who to ask and what to ignore. We understand that one folder is just for show, while another one actually matters, but AI has no political instinct or lived understanding of which source to trust. It only sees retrievable context. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, it just isn't aligned with how the organization imagines its own reality. When leadership blames a model for being generic, they are often seeing what happens when an environment has no clear hierarchy. If 5 sources say similar but not identical things, the response gets flattened and the truth becomes probabilistic. Once truth becomes probabilistic, decision support starts degrading, especially in companies that claim they already have the data. Usually that just means the data exists somewhere, not that it exists in a usable or governed shape. Presence is not quality, and storage is not clarity. AI exposes these gaps all at once. The first audit AI runs isn't on user enthusiasm. It runs on the state of your information environment to see if it can find signal without dragging in noise. If the answer is no, the failure pattern begins as something quiet, An answer that is plausible but off, or helpful enough to keep using but unreliable enough to keep checking. That is the trap. People assume the problem is in the response layer, but the response layer is rarely the issue. The first problem is almost always a fragmented data reality that makes the system operationally misleading. Scenario 1. Overshared files and permission chaos. To make this concrete, let's look at how AI exposes organizational debt through overshared files. I'm not talking about a dramatic data breach, but something much more ordinary. A person opens Copilot, asks a normal question, and gets a response grounded in documents they technically had access to, but were never expected to see. Before AI, excessive access could sit quietly for years without anyone noticing. A team site might have been shared too broadly during a project, or a folder inherited permissions from an old department structure that no longer exists. From a human perspective, this looked messy but manageable because most people weren't actively searching through all that noise. Then AI arrives and retrieval starts happening at machine speed, turning broad access into broad context. Now, stale or sensitive material can surface inside a normal productivity flow, and people experience that as a failure of the AI. They ask why it's using an old restructuring document or a private deck, but the problem isn't that the AI saw too much. The problem is that your system already allowed it, and the AI simply revealed a permission sprawl that was already there. This is why the scenario matters for leaders. Once synthesis gets easier, poor permission design stops being a quiet IT hygiene problem and becomes a major operational risk. If irrelevant or old content is accessible, it doesn't just sit there. It participates in the conversation and distorts the truth. I've seen cases where people weren't shocked because the content was confidential, but because the content was visible at all. It exposed a massive gap between the formal access model and the assumed responsibility model. The system said the user could reach it, but the business would have said that user should never be making meaning from that material. Security teams often frame permissions as a protection boundary, which is important, but with AI, permissions also become a relevance boundary. Who can see what now shapes how answers are formed, which changes the business implication completely. A messy access model used to be an occasional inconvenience, but now it creates contextual pollution that influences what people trust and act on. Many organizations are discovering they've been relying on obscurity instead of actual governance. Files were considered safe only because they were buried, and sensitive info was hidden because nobody had the time to dig through old folders. That isn't control, it's just a delay that AI has now removed. If a huge portion of your content is accessible beyond its intended audience, AI turns that latent risk into active infrastructure. The people inside the system feel it immediately when they notice strange references or unexpected sources in their daily work. That isn't a side effect, but a structural signal that your access model no longer matches your operating model. When that mismatch becomes visible, the executive response can't just be telling people to write better prompts. Prompting didn't create this problem, the environment did. This scenario isn't really about files, but about a business discovering that its permission structure reflects its messy history rather than its current reality. Once AI starts reading that history as if it were the current truth, the system produces exactly the kind of confusion it was already storing, only much faster than before. Permission amplification is a business problem, not just a security problem. We need to go one level deeper here, because if we frame this only as a security issue, we miss the actual business consequence. It is true that oversharing creates exposure risk, and we know that least privilege matters for compliance, especially when sensitive material ends up in the wrong place. But for most organizations, the immediate threat isn't legal exposure or a data breach. The real danger is decision distortion, and that is the part most executives completely underestimate. When AI inherits broad access, it doesn't just increase the chance that someone sees a file they shouldn't. It also increases the chance that your people start building their professional judgment on context that was never meant to guide them. This shifts the entire conversation because permission sprawl is no longer just about who can open a document. It is about what data enters the final answer. Think about how this plays out in a normal workday. A person asks for a summary, a manager looks for background before a big decision, or a team asks for the latest position on a customer issue. The AI starts assembling an answer from everything it can reach under that user's identity, pulling in old documents, half-relevant notes, and strategy drafts that were never finalized. It grabs sensitive content that might be technically visible to that user but is operationally out of scope for the task at hand. From a system perspective, this broad access is not neutral because it actively shapes the meaning layer of the work. This means over-permissioning creates two distinct kinds of risk at the same time. You have the obvious exposure of data, but you also have degraded relevance in your outputs. In day-to-day business operations, degraded relevance is actually the more common failure mode. Most leaders imagine risk as a leak, where a private conversation becomes visible or an internal document ends up in the wrong hands. While that matters, the more frequent damage is much quieter and harder to spot. People receive answers that include too much context or the wrong context entirely, yet those answers sound authoritative simply because the information was retrievable. Once that happens, bad access quickly turns into bad interpretation, and that is a fundamental business problem. I've seen organizations tolerate messy access for years because the practical cost felt low at the time. People were busy and search friction was high, so even if the wrong material existed, it rarely entered the active flow of a decision. AI changes that dynamic instantly by lowering the cost of retrieval so much that your access debt becomes operational debt overnight. Now map that to your leadership reality. If a specific role has accumulated permissions across old projects, previous teams, and broad collaboration spaces, the AI treats all of that as available decision context. It isn't doing this maliciously or incorrectly, it is just being consistent. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do by honoring the access model, but the problem is that the access model no longer reflects the actual business model. That gap is where trust in the technology starts collapsing. A user often cannot tell if a result is wrong because the model made a mistake or because the environment supplied weak context. They just know the answer feels off, so they slow down, they verify every word, and they hesitate. Suddenly, your decision latency goes up across the entire company. This is why I believe we have to reframe least privilege for the AI era. It is no longer just a security principle, it is a form of relevance engineering. By tightening permissions, you reduce the amount of stale or out-of-scope material that can contaminate an answer. You are narrowing the context window around a specific responsibility to help the system produce outputs that a person should actually act on. That isn't just bureaucracy, it is quality control for machine-assisted judgment. Why does this matter so much? Because when the wrong people see the wrong context, the damage goes far beyond a simple leak. They start making assumptions they were never supposed to make, often overreading an internal debate as a final direction or treating historical planning material as current intent. They confuse visibility with authority, and then the organization has to waste time correcting errors created by its own inherited access structure. Again, this is not an AI failure pattern, it is an operating model failure pattern that AI has simply revealed. The tool is making an old mismatch visible to everyone. If leaders want better outcomes, they have to stop treating permissions as a back-office technical issue. Permissions define the shape of the business reality the machine is allowed to use. If that shape is too broad or too noisy, the output will reflect that, not because the AI is broken, but because the environment is. But access is only half the issue here. Even when the access is cleaned up, many organizations hit the next structural wall. They never built a usable hierarchy to define what information actually matters to the business. Scenario 2. Label loss and inconsistent classification. The second place AI exposes structural weakness is in classification, and this one is even more revealing than the first. While permissions tell us who can reach a file, classification tells us whether the business ever agreed on what that file actually is. We need to know what is strategic, what is routine, and what is safe to reuse versus what should stay constrained. In a lot of organizations, that hierarchy exists mostly in people's heads rather than in the system. Longtime employees know which deck matters and which folder is politically important, but the environment itself does not carry that meaning consistently. Some files are labeled while many are not, and while some teams apply strict naming rules, others ignore them entirely. You end up with content that is current but looks informal, sitting next to obsolete content that looks official. Once AI enters that environment, this implicit importance stops working because AI cannot prioritize what the organization never made explicit. Leaders often assume the problem is that AI lacks judgment, but from a system perspective, the bigger problem is that the business never translated its judgment into a usable information structure. The model retrieves what it can and weighs what is available, and if your environment treats critical content and low-value noise as structurally similar, your answer quality will flatten out very quickly. This is where label loss becomes a serious signal for the business. Even when source content carries meaning, the generated outputs don't always preserve that meaning in a way the business can reliably govern. A sensitive source can become an ordinary-looking summary, or a strategic discussion can turn into a neutral draft. A high-context document might be reduced to a clean paragraph that sounds safe, even when the substance still carries a high level of sensitivity. That matters because derivative content travels much faster than source content. People paste these summaries into chats, drop them into emails, and reuse them in decks. The information has moved, but the original protective meaning has weakened along the way. The issue isn't just about missing labels, it is about meaning decay. The organization had one chance to tell the environment what mattered, it did it inconsistently, and then AI accelerated the reuse of that ambiguity. I've seen teams describe this by saying the tool feels generic. But generic is usually what happens when nothing in the environment tells the machine what deserves more weight. If everything is shared, nothing is prioritized. If nothing is clearly owned, nothing has stable authority. When naming is inconsistent and versioning is weak, the model cannot distinguish signal from noise in the way a well-aligned business should. The results start sounding broad and useful enough, but they aren't truly dependable. That is a structural warning. When classification fails, the business is discovering that it never built a usable hierarchy of information for humans, and now it certainly doesn't have one for machines. Why did this happen? For years, organizations treated labels as a form of compliance decoration or a policy burden for the security team. It was an administrative layer that people could ignore as long as the work was getting done. But labels are a declaration of business importance. They tell the environment what should be protected and what should not be recombined casually. Without those declarations, AI inherits ambiguity as its operating context. Ambiguous context produces unstable outputs that aren't always obviously wrong. Sometimes they are worse because they are calmly incomplete or smoothly misleading. They are difficult to challenge because the wording sounds coherent even when the structure behind it is weak. This is where executives need to pay close attention. If your AI outputs feel inconsistent, do not look only at how people are writing prompts. Look at your metadata, your naming conventions, and your version discipline. Look at whether your critical domains of information have any clear ownership at all. Output inconsistency is very often metadata inconsistency in disguise. Once that becomes visible, the implication is bigger than simple document hygiene. It means the organization has been operating without a shared, machine-readable understanding of what matters most. That is a massive structural gap, and AI is very good at finding those gaps. Once speed enters the system, your ambiguity stops hiding and starts compounding. Classification failure means the business never agreed on what matters. Let's stay with that for a minute because this is where the issue stops being a technical glitch and becomes a deep operational problem. When classification is weak, your business isn't just dealing with messy files or a cluttered drive. You are actually dealing with unspoken priorities. And the reality is that unspoken priorities do not scale in a modern enterprise. A human team can survive on implication for a long time because people learn what matters through proximity. They pick it up in meetings, they sense it in side conversations, and they see who gets copied on the most important emails. They notice which deck gets revised 3 times before the board sees it, or which spreadsheet everyone quietly trusts, even though it lives in the wrong folder with a cryptic name. That is how importance usually works in a real organization. It doesn't happen through an explicit structure, but through social interpretation and shared history. But here's the thing, AI cannot read social interpretation. It has no way to detect that one unlabeled file is politically sensitive while another is just background noise. The machine cannot infer that a document matters simply because the CFO prefers that specific version. It has no way of knowing that your naming convention broke down 6 months ago and that every human in the room is now compensating for that failure manually. It can only process the environment that actually exists, not the one you intended to build. So when classification fails, what the AI reveals is not just a weakness in your metadata. It reveals that the business never actually converted its priorities into infrastructure, and that is a much deeper problem to solve. Labels, ownership, and version control are not just boring admin tasks, they are declarations of intent. These markers say that this specific information matters, that this version is current, and that this data is the authoritative source we want both people and machines to rely on. Without those clear declarations, your information estate becomes completely flat. And as we've seen in system design, flat information always creates flat, uninspired answers. That is exactly why so many AI outputs feel broadly useful but strangely weak when the stakes finally go up. The model is simply responding to an environment that has no clear hierarchy, doing exactly what probabilistic systems do when importance is left implicit. It averages, it blends, and it softens the edges of the data. In executive work, a softened truth is a dangerous thing. Decisions do not improve when everything sounds equally relevant. They improve when the business has enough structural clarity to separate the critical signal from the background noise. This is also why inconsistent classification often shows up as a sudden inconsistency in confidence. One answer feels sharp and actionable, but the next one feels vague and unhelpful. One workflow benefits from the automation, while another becomes a source of constant frustration for the team. That usually means you have islands of clarity rather than enterprise-wide clarity, where one team knows how to govern its material, while another relies entirely on habit and memory. AI exposes both of these conditions at the same time, and then leaders wonder why adoption feels so uneven across the company. The reason is simple. The machine is entering 2 different realities inside the same organization. From a system perspective, that isn't an AI problem, it's an organizational agreement problem. The business never reached a durable agreement on what counts as approved or protected. If that agreement does not exist, the AI simply inherits that ambiguity by default. Now, you might be thinking that people still know what matters, and sometimes they do, but that is exactly the point I want to make. If your people have to carry that knowledge informally, then you have built a dependency on human interpretation instead of structural clarity. That is a fragile way to run a company, and it represents a massive hidden operating cost. It becomes visible the moment AI starts participating in work that used to rely on context held only in people's heads. So when leaders tell me their AI output is too generic, I translate that differently. I tell them the business has not made its importance model explicit enough for the system to understand. Generic output is what you get when the system cannot see rank, weight, or authority in the source environment. This has a very direct business consequence because if importance is unclear, then speed becomes a risk. People start moving faster on weak distinctions, acting on material that sounds right instead of material that is structurally correct. They confuse how easy it is to find a file with how significant that file actually is. They confuse retrieval with trustworthiness. And that is where performance starts degrading under the surface of the daily workflow. Classification failure is not really about labels. It is about your decision architecture. It tells you whether the business has encoded what matters in a way that humans and machines can both actually use. If the answer is no, then the AI will keep surfacing a very hard truth. The organization never agreed clearly enough on what deserves priority, and now you have to map that to a world where speed matters more than ever. Scenario 3, the week 6 to 12 stall. This is the specific point where a lot of AI rollouts start losing altitude and slowing down. It doesn't happen in week 1 or during the launch meeting or even when the first impressive demos are shown to the staff. It usually happens much later, somewhere around week 6 or week 10, when the pattern of behavior starts to change. At the very beginning, the energy is high because people are naturally curious about the new technology. They try the tool, they share their best examples, and leadership sees all that activity and assumes they have real momentum. For a short time, that assumption looks reasonable because there are visible wins happening everywhere. Summaries get generated faster, drafting feels lighter, and a few strong outputs travel around the company as proof that the investment was the right move. But novelty is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that early phase, and novelty has a way of hiding structural weakness for a while. In those early weeks, people are still testing the boundaries and are generally more forgiving of the tool's mistakes. They expect some rough edges and are willing to overlook inconsistency because the capability itself still feels like magic. This creates a very misleading signal for the leadership team. Usage looks like trust, experimentation looks like adoption, and general interest looks like long-term value, but those are not the same thing at all. And why does the stall happen later? It happens because after a few weeks, the tool stops being a curiosity and starts entering the flow of real high-stakes work. That is when the standard for success changes completely. People no longer ask if the tool can do something interesting. They ask if they can actually rely on it when the deadline is looming. That is a much harder test to pass. And it is exactly where many organizations hit a wall they didn't see coming. Edge cases begin to accumulate, like a summary referencing the wrong document or a draft pulling from a stale context that is no longer relevant. Someone gets an answer that conflicts with what another team knows to be true, and while none of these incidents are catastrophic on their own, they create a sense of drift. Trust is incredibly sensitive to that kind of drift. One wrong answer in a high-pressure business context does more damage than 10 decent ones do good. This is especially true when the person using the tool is already under intense time pressure and cannot afford to double-check every single word. Busy professionals do not need a tool that is occasionally impressive. They need one that reduces their effort without introducing a new layer of uncertainty. If the uncertainty increases, the entire value proposition starts collapsing. The rollout doesn't fail all at once. Instead, it starts to thin out across the departments. The champions and power users stay engaged because they are closest to the rollout narrative, but everyone else starts narrowing how they use the tool. They use it when the stakes are low, they avoid it when the context is messy, and they stop depending on it for anything that requires real confidence. Because this decline is so uneven, leadership often misreads the situation entirely. They see a handful of active users and assume the adoption is going fine, but the broad middle of the company has already started withdrawing. They aren't doing this because they are resistant to change, but because they are detecting a system risk. That distinction is vital to understand. When people slow down after week 6, it is often framed as an enablement problem that requires more training or better internal comms. But here's the thing, you cannot train people to ignore structural unreliability. If the outputs keep revealing permission drift and weak ownership, then skepticism is the only rational response from your team. The stall is not a motivation problem. It is a signal that the environment underneath the tool is not stable enough to sustain machine-assisted work at scale. Once you see the stall that way, your interpretation of the problem changes completely. Week 6 to 12 is the phase where the organization stops interacting with the idea of AI and starts interacting with the reality of itself. That is why this period matters so much for the long-term success of the project. It is the moment where the rollout stops being a technology story and becomes an operating model story. The tool hasn't suddenly changed, but the environment has simply become visible through repeated use. What people are responding to is not the interface, but the business reality that the interface is surfacing. So when adoption slows down in that window, I would not ask how to drive more usage. I would ask what the system is showing us that our people no longer want to compensate for manually. If you audited your information systems the same way you audit your financial ones, what would you find? Is that system designed to sustain your growth, or is it slowly draining your momentum over time? Why trust drops so fast? Trust drops fast because people aren't evaluating AI in the abstract, but are instead testing whether it's safe to lean on when the pressure is actually on. That is a very different kind of test than just playing with a new tool. In low-stakes moments, people are naturally generous with technology. So if a summary is slightly off or a draft sounds generic, they just tighten it up and move on. They shrug at the lack of nuance because the cost of being wrong is basically zero. But the moment a task carries real consequence, that tolerance for good enough disappears immediately. A manager preparing for a difficult customer escalation doesn't want a maybe useful answer, and a team lead making staffing decisions doesn't need probable context. When a leader heads into a board conversation, they cannot afford language that sounds right if the source data underneath it is unstable. One weak answer in a high-stakes moment lands much harder than 10 decent answers in low-stakes work, and that is the basic trust equation we have to solve. And why is that? In business reality, confidence is asymmetrical, meaning small gains accumulate slowly, while visible mistakes reset the clock instantly. This is especially true when a tool presents itself with such high fluency. A rough spreadsheet is obviously incomplete, but a polished AI answer is harder to challenge because it arrives already formed and looking professional. This moves the entire checking burden onto the person using the tool, and once that happens a few times, people start protecting themselves. That protection shows up as specific behavior, where users open the original file, ask a colleague for a second opinion, or manually compare multiple outputs. They might keep the tool in their workflow to look productive, but they no longer let it reduce their actual judgment effort. This is where trust starts collapsing in practical terms, not when people stop using the software entirely, but when they stop delegating any real confidence to it. Leadership often watches adoption dashboards and sees plenty of activity, noting that prompts are being entered and drafts are being created every day. They assume the rollout is healthy because the numbers are up, but usage is not the same thing as trust. A person can use a tool constantly and still not rely on it for anything that actually matters, which creates a hidden split between the dashboard and the user. The dashboard sees interaction, but the user feels risk, and that gap only gets wider when leaders demand adoption while the people inside the system ask a much simpler question. Can I trust this enough to move faster without exposing myself to a mistake? If the answer is no, then manual checking becomes the only rational response, even though it carries a massive cost in cognitive drag. Now the person has to hold two different workflows at once, the AI path and the verification path, which effectively doubles their interpretation work. It cancels the clean promise of reduction, and what was meant to remove friction becomes just another layer for the employee to manage. The business might claim that AI is saving time, but the people inside the system know they only save time after they've made sure the machine didn't quietly pull in the wrong data. This isn't resistance to change. It is local risk management by people who understand operational complexity. Trust falls fastest among your best people because they know where the edge cases live and which processes depend on stale information. When AI answers confidently inside a messy environment, these experts aren't impressed by the speed, they are alerted by the risk. One wrong answer outweighs 100 useful summaries because summaries only prove convenience, while errors in big moments call into question the entire system's reliability. Reliability is the only real threshold for adoption, and without it, the organization doesn't scale assistance, it just scales caution. If you see trust dropping, don't start by asking how to improve enthusiasm or culture. Instead, ask what the underlying information estate is teaching your users about the risk of being wrong. Trust in AI is always downstream of the environment feeding it. So if your data is fragmented, overshared, or weakly owned, then skepticism is just a system outcome. Once you see it through that lens, the metrics you need to watch become much clearer than they were before. We shouldn't be looking at prompts, licenses, or excitement levels to judge success. What actually matters is whether decisions are getting faster without the level of confidence getting worse. The metric that matters, decision latency. If we want a serious metric for AI, it can't be about how many licenses were assigned or how many people tried the tool this week. Those are just activity metrics that tell us something happened without proving the business actually got any better. The metric that truly matters is decision latency, which measures how long it takes for a person or a team to move from a question to a confident action. AI is being sold as a way to accelerate the business through faster access to context and quicker drafting, but the executive question should remain simple. Did decisions actually get faster without becoming less reliable for the organization? If the answer is yes, then your system is likely aligned well enough for AI to add value. If the answer is no, the system is telling you that the environment is still too noisy or fragmented to support machine-assisted speed. I prefer decision latency as a metric because it cuts through the theater that usually surrounds new technology rollouts. You can have high usage and enthusiastic champions while your teams are still stuck in endless checking loops. You might see polished internal success stories, but underneath the surface, Managers are still reopening source files and verifying context manually before they commit to a path. In those cases, AI isn't actually reducing friction, it is just relocating it to a different part of the process. From a system perspective, reducing the time it takes to finish a single task is never enough on its own. If a summary is produced in 30 seconds, but the team spends 20 minutes validating the material, then overall latency has actually worsened. This creates a new layer of uncertainty inside the workflow. And because uncertainty is delay, the business loses ground. Decision latency is a unifying measure because it forces us to look at the whole path from data quality and permissions to ownership and approval clarity. All of these factors show up in one place. How quickly can your people move forward with real confidence? Most organizations measure success too close to the tool by counting interactions or active users, but those don't tell you if the company is thinking or acting with less drag. If AI adds an interpretation layer rather than removing one, your volume of work might go up while your actual performance stays flat or declines. You might think that decision latency sounds difficult to measure perfectly, but you don't need a perfect spreadsheet to see the pattern. Just ask if decisions depending on cross-functional context are happening faster now than they were 6 months ago. Check if managers are spending less time reconstructing history or if teams are escalating fewer clarification loops to their leadership. Are people moving from the output of the tool to a final action more smoothly? Or are they still pausing to ask if they can trust the result? That pause is the signal you need to watch, and you will usually feel it long before you find a way to formalize it in a report. A healthy AI deployment shortens the distance between having context and making a decision, while an unhealthy one shortens retrieval but lengthens the time spent building confidence. That is the trap, where it looks like speed on the surface, while hidden latency grows underneath. If you are responsible for AI strategy, stop obsessing over adoption theater and start looking closely at your decision pathways. Find where they stall, where people still feel the need to double-check, and where outputs are generated quickly but acted on slowly. That is where the system is speaking back to you, and when latency doesn't improve despite all the activity, the message is quite clear. The tool is not your bottleneck, but the operating environment is. The executive shift is to stop asking if people are using the AI and start asking if it reduced the time between knowing and deciding. The anchor case, the AI-ready organization that wasn't. I want to anchor this discussion in a specific organizational pattern I've seen play out more than once. From the outside, this company looked like the perfect candidate for a transformation because they had a massive Microsoft 365 footprint and used modern workplace language in every meeting. They had SharePoint in place, Teams was deeply embedded in their culture, and executive sponsorship was visible at every level. Innovation messaging was already established across the company, providing all the signals most leadership teams point to when they claim they are ready for AI. The licenses were approved and specific use cases had been identified, while internal champions were nominated to lead the charge. Internal communication positioned the rollout as a serious step forward for the business, and on paper, every bit of that strategy made perfect sense. Readiness was being assessed through visible assets like tool availability and platform maturity, alongside leadership commitment and scheduled training sessions. This is how most organizations frame AI readiness today, focusing on whether they have the technology, the support, and a solid rollout plan. But here's the thing, none of those questions actually test for structural alignment. They test deployment intent. And I've learned that deployment intent is not the same thing as operating readiness. This organization expected exactly what you would expect from a high-end implementation, looking for faster decisions and less time spent searching for information. They wanted better productivity in their documents and internal coordination, hoping for a strategic edge by extracting more value from the data already sitting inside their tenant. Early on, the signals looked good enough to support that optimistic story because people genuinely liked the summaries and felt that drafting was moving faster. Retrieval seemed impressive at first, and leaders saw enough useful output to believe the business case was proving itself in real time. That's what made the next phase so important, because underneath that polished start, the environment had never actually been aligned around how truth moved through the business. The system was cluttered with duplicates across various sites, and old project spaces were still being treated as live reference points by the users. Inherited permissions from previous org structures remained active, which meant there was no clear ownership for core information domains. Multiple versions of key material were still technically accessible to the AI, and the business relied heavily on people who knew how to navigate around all that mess. From a system perspective, the organization wasn't actually AI ready. It was simply AI accessible. Those two terms sound similar, but the reality is they couldn't be more different. AI accessible means the machine can reach the environment, but AI-ready means the environment can support machine-assisted judgment without degrading trust. That second part was missing entirely because the readiness narrative focused on visible modernization rather than hidden coherence. They had the stack and the story, but they had never tested whether their information estate could support reliable synthesis across real business workflows. That gap stayed hidden as long as the rollout was being judged through simple activity metrics. Once people began using the tool for work that carried real consequence, the system started answering back with mismatches and errors. Responses were grounded in outdated material, and context was pulled from spaces that were technically reachable but operationally wrong. The answers sounded polished enough to pass a quick glance, yet they were weak enough to make experienced employees stop and check the facts. This is the turning point where the rollout stops being a technology success story and becomes a painful architectural audit. The organization had assumed that a strong Microsoft 365 foundation meant structural readiness, but what they actually had was a well-furnished surface over inconsistent information logic. You can have modern tools and still carry massive amounts of old operating debt, just like you can have executive enthusiasm while leaving ownership problems unresolved. When you have broad access to AI but no reliable hierarchy for what counts as authoritative, the technology doesn't transform the business. Instead, it exposes the difference between the business as leadership describes it and the business as it actually functions. This anchor case matters because it is incredibly common, showing how a company can look digitally mature while remaining structurally fragile. It can look organized from the outside while relying internally on informal correction and hidden expertise to keep things moving. AI is very good at finding that gap and bringing it to the surface. When leaders ask why an apparently ready organization still struggles with adoption, I think the answer is usually quite simple. It wasn't a lack of ambition or a lack of technology that held them back. It was a lack of alignment between their information environment and the decisions they expected the AI to support. Once the tool touched real work, that misalignment became impossible to ignore. What actually happened inside that organization? What happened next wasn't dramatic from the outside, as there was no single collapse or big announcement that the rollout had failed. There was no obvious technical breakdown to point to, but what happened was quieter and much more important for the long term. The system started speaking through the outputs, and a team would ask for a summary only to get a response that referenced an old deck that shouldn't have mattered anymore. Someone else would ask for background on an active initiative and receive an answer stitched together from duplicate files across different sites. Each of those files carried a slightly different version of the same story, leading to context that was technically accessible but clearly not meant to shape a professional judgment. Once that starts happening repeatedly, people don't need a formal audit to know something is off because they can feel the friction in their daily work. The issue wasn't that the tool produced total nonsense, and in many cases, it actually produced something close enough to be useful. That is exactly why this phase is so deceptive for leadership teams. If the output were obviously wrong every single time, trust would collapse immediately and the diagnosis would be much simpler to handle. Instead, the answers were often plausible or even helpful, but they remained inconsistent in the exact places where the organization was already structurally inconsistent. That pattern tells us the model wasn't failing randomly. It was reflecting the actual shape of the environment it was fed. When teams started comparing outputs against what they knew to be true operationally, the drift in the organization's own information reality became visible. Current material was constantly competing with stale material, and ownership was too weak to establish a reliable source of truth for the machine to follow. Permissions were broad enough that irrelevant context kept entering the answer path, while duplicate content made synthesis look complete while blending contradictions. The people closest to the operational complexity saw this first, and trust usually dropped fastest among those who understood the work in detail. These weren't anti-AI resistors, they were the people with the clearest view of where the system was fragile and prone to error. They knew which files were outdated and which decisions had changed informally without the documentation ever catching up. They knew where the process still depended on a specific person saying, ignore that version and use this one instead. When AI surfaced a polished answer from the wrong mix of sources, these high-context users recognized the failure immediately. This is why the strongest skepticism often comes from the most informed users rather than those who simply fear new technology. Meanwhile, leadership could still see enough good output to believe the rollout was broadly working, which creates a dangerous split in the company culture. Upward, the story remains optimistic, but downward, the people doing the real work start building private caution into their behavior. They begin to verify more and cross-check every result, often reopening original files just to be sure. They might rely on the tool for rough compression or brainstorming, but they won't use it for confident movement in a high-stakes project. The adoption story continues on the surface while trust is eroding underneath. And at that point, the rollout stops being about AI capability. It becomes a question of organizational honesty, because the tool is showing something the business had managed to avoid confronting directly. The environment was never aligned enough to support the kind of acceleration leadership expected, and the AI didn't fail so much as the system it relied on was never ready. The model did exactly what it was supposed to do by retrieving and synthesizing what the tenant made available. The problem was that what the tenant made available did not reflect a clean operating reality, but rather years of accumulation and duplicated work. It reflected inherited access, weak classification, and manual compensation by people who had learned how to function inside the mess. Once AI started working across that mess, the organization could no longer pretend the situation was manageable because it became visible in the daily output. Adoption is no longer a technology conversation at that stage. It becomes a business architecture conversation. The question is no longer about how to get more people to use the tool, but rather what kind of organization the tool just revealed. Context fragmentation and the illusion of intelligence. This is where the problem becomes dangerous, because once context is fragmented, AI can still sound remarkably intelligent. That fragmentation actually makes the output feel more impressive than it really is, which is a trap for anyone relying on the system. The model is simply very good at producing smooth, professional language from uneven or broken material. It can take scattered notes, old documents, and overlapping files and turn them into something that reads like a complete authoritative answer. That is the illusion. The answer feels whole, but the context underneath it is completely broken. When people claim an AI is hallucinating, they are sometimes right, but very often what looks like a hallucination is actually just context blending. The model isn't inventing facts from thin air, but it is combining fragments that should never have been treated as a single coherent truth in the first place. That distinction matters for leadership. If leaders misread fragmentation as a pure model failure, they start looking for fixes in the wrong places by asking for better prompts or stronger models. But if the environment is feeding the machine partial truths and stale data at the same time, then better fluency only gives you a cleaner expression of a structural problem. I call this the illusion of intelligence because it looks like understanding, but it is usually just elegant compression across a broken landscape. Now, map that to how people actually work inside Microsoft 365. A decision trail might start in an Outlook email, move into a Teams chat, get summarized in a meeting, and finally show up in a PowerPoint deck. From a human perspective, we can usually reconstruct that sequence because we remember what changed, and we know which meeting actually mattered. We know who overruled a decision and which Teams thread is more current than the deck sitting in the project folder. But the machine does not experience history that way. It only sees retrievable fragments. When those fragments point in different directions, the model does what probabilistic systems do and generates the most plausible shape across them. That can sound convincing and even feel helpful in the moment, but if the source environment has no stable center of gravity, the answer isn't grounded in truth. It is grounded in proximity, and proximity is not authority. This is why leaders need to be careful with the word intelligence. If your environment is fragmented, what you are seeing is not intelligence, but rather synthesis without any real coherence. That might be fine for low-risk work like meeting compression or rough drafting, but the moment you ask the system to support judgment, the cracks become a serious liability. A fragmented environment does not just produce weaker answers, it produces false confidence, which is much harder to detect than an obvious error. I remember sitting with teams who told me the answer looked perfect until they checked the source. That sentence tells you everything you need to know about the problem. The issue wasn't the quality of the language, but the integrity of the architecture. The machine gave them a polished surface over an unstable foundation. Once that starts happening, people stop trusting the appearance of completeness and start assuming every answer contains hidden drift. That is an exhausting way to work because every output carries an invisible tax. The AI isn't being malicious, but the organization never built a clear path from information to meaning. When context is fragmented, intelligence becomes performative, and the model sounds like it knows more than the environment allows. That is where speed turns from an advantage into a massive risk. The faster you move on blended fragments, the faster you scale misunderstanding across the entire company. It doesn't always happen loudly. Sometimes it's just a slightly wrong summary or a decision shaped by outdated context that nobody noticed. Context fragmentation creates a business environment where AI appears more reliable than the underlying reality deserves. Once that gap opens, speed stops helping and starts multiplying confusion. Process acceleration. Faster chaos is still chaos. This is the point where many leaders reach the wrong conclusion. They see AI speeding things up and assume the process is improving, but speed is not proof of health. Speed only tells you that motion has increased and the system can move more output through the same path in less time. That sounds like a win until you look at the path itself. If the workflow underneath is already vague or dependent on hidden manual corrections, AI does not fix the issue. It compresses it. Once that happens, the weakness becomes easier to miss at first and much harder to manage later on. Faster chaos is still chaos, and in many environments, it is actually much worse. Broken processes used to reveal themselves through slowness because you could feel the drag and notice the waiting. You knew approvals were unclear because everything kept stalling, and you knew handoffs were weak because people had to keep chasing each other. The friction was visible and annoying, but at least it was there. Then AI enters the workflow and suddenly summaries and drafts are generated in seconds. For a moment, it feels like the process has improved, but if the underlying approvals are still vague, nothing fundamental has changed. The process is still weak. It just looks cleaner on the surface. This is a dangerous moment for an organization because a slow, broken process triggers attention, but a fast, broken process is often mistaken for transformation. We tend to confuse acceleration with redesign and assume that less visible effort means better structure. A bad handoff completed faster is still a bad handoff, and an unclear approval chain supported by AI is still an unclear approval chain. A process that produces polished outputs without resolving who owns the decision has not been optimized. It has simply been cosmetically upgraded. I have seen workflows where AI reduced the effort of the blank page dramatically. People got their first drafts and meeting recaps quickly, but then the same old bottlenecks reappeared immediately after. They still had to ask who approves the document or which version is the real one. Those questions did not disappear. They just arrived later in the chain. The organization felt faster at the front, but remained just as confused at the point of commitment. This means latency was displaced rather than removed, which is not process optimization. From a system perspective, that is structural compensation. The machine makes the workflow look fluid, while the business still relies on manual interpretation to keep things safe. Once output generation becomes easy, organizations start producing way too much intermediate material. If the process already lacked clear gates and decision rights, AI just increases the volume moving through that ambiguity. Now, it isn't just chaos, it is scalable chaos with more content entering a weak path. Teams begin to assume that because something was generated quickly, it is ready to move. Every process has exceptions, but healthy processes know exactly where those exceptions should go. Unhealthy processes route them to specific people who carry the logic in their heads. If AI accelerates the standard flow without fixing that exception path, those people become completely overloaded. They become the human patch layer for a faster machine environment, which is a single point of failure under increased load. When leaders tell me AI is helping them move faster, I always ask, faster toward what? Are you moving toward clearer decisions or just toward the same old ambiguity with better formatting? If the structure is weak, speed does not create maturity. It only amplifies the throughput inside an immature system. Once you see that, the implication is hard to avoid. You don't need more acceleration. You need to know who owns what when the process stops being straightforward. Unclear ownership becomes an AI failure pattern. This is where the entire situation usually narrows down to one uncomfortable truth, which is that the organization never actually established clear ownership in the areas where they expected AI to help the most. That matters far more than people realize, because while AI is excellent at supporting retrieval, drafting, and synthesis, it is fundamentally incapable of resolving unclear responsibility on behalf of the business. If nobody clearly owns the source material, then nobody can truly own the answer the machine provides, and once that happens, machine assistance just adds another layer of ambiguity instead of actually reducing the team's effort. I've seen this show up in a very specific pattern, where a team asks an AI for the latest view on a customer issue, an internal policy, or a delivery status. The answer usually comes back quickly and sounds plausible, often even referencing material that looks relevant to the task at hand, but then someone asks the question that actually matters. They ask who owns this information, and suddenly the room goes quiet because the responsibility is hidden even if the data is visible. One department might think another team is maintaining the document, or perhaps a manager assumed the process owner had updated the source, while a project team left behind material that nobody ever formally retired. In many cases, an old working group still influences the information space long after the actual decision authority has moved somewhere else, which creates a massive gap in the workflow. AI produces an answer from whatever reachable context it can find, but the organization cannot produce accountability with that same speed, and that is the core failure pattern. And why is that? It's because ownership is the structural bridge between information and action. And without that bridge, information stays purely interpretive. People can read the output, discuss it, and even reuse it, but they cannot move confidently from that output to a real commitment because nobody has made it clear who stands behind the truth. That is exactly why unclear ownership creates such a consistent problem when you try to scale these systems. The machine can only accelerate a path that already exists, so if the path from content to responsibility is missing, the answer might appear useful without actually reducing real business friction. It simply triggers a second loop of manual questions about who should validate the data, who approves the result, and who has the authority to act on it. Once those questions begin, the speed gain from the AI disappears entirely, and the business finds itself right back in the middle of manual arbitration. Now map that reality to what many organizations call knowledge work, where a huge amount of key information is maintained socially rather than structurally. One person knows which version of a file actually matters, another knows which exception changed the process last quarter, and someone else knows that the published rule isn't how the work gets done anymore. These people are functioning as invisible control points, acting as the living middleware between messy information and usable judgment, and humans can actually do that for a long time. It is incredibly inefficient, but it works well enough to stay invisible until AI starts operating directly on that visible layer. If the visible layer has no explicit owner, then every answer the AI generates inherits that same uncertainty, which is why I'd argue that unclear ownership isn't just a governance issue. It is a resilience issue, because every time AI enters a workflow without clear responsibility boundaries, the organization just rediscovers the same old dependencies. There is still a person everyone has to ask. There is still a hidden expert who decides what is real, and there is still a human checkpoint carrying context that the infrastructure never absorbed. From a system perspective, that is a single point of failure, and systems with single points of failure do not scale well when you try to accelerate them. The irony here is that AI often makes these ownership gaps much easier to feel than they were before. Before these tools arrived, people tolerated the delay because the whole workflow was slow anyway. But now the answer arrives instantly while the commitment still waits for the same overloaded individual. The machine looks fast while the organization looks confused, and that is not an AI maturity problem so much as it is an operating model problem made visible through speed. If leaders want better outcomes, I would not suggest starting with smarter prompts, but rather by asking a much simpler set of questions. For every critical information domain, you need to know who owns the source, who owns the decision, and who owns the update path when reality inevitably changes. If those answers remain unclear, the AI will keep surfacing the same frustrating result of fast output paired with slow commitment. That tells you something essential about the business, which is that its resilience was never actually distributed across the organization. It was concentrated in a few people who were compensating for a broken structure all along, and the system is finally calling their bluff. Why executives misread the problem. So why do executives keep misreading this situation so consistently? From their vantage point, the rollout still looks like a standard technology story because they see the capability, the demos that work, and the strong vendor messaging. They see internal enthusiasm and a visible pattern of people doing more with less effort in specific moments. And while those signals are real, they are also dangerously incomplete. The problem is that executive interpretation usually starts at the tool layer instead of looking at the dependency layer where the real risks live. They often ask what the model can do when they should be asking what the model depends on to function safely and consistently inside the business. That shift in perspective sounds small, but it changes everything about how you manage the rollout. Most leaders are used to technology creating an advantage through simple functionality, where you buy the platform, roll out the workflow, and then measure usage to scale what works. That logic is fine when a tool operates in a controlled process with explicit rules, but AI is different because it works across the inherent ambiguity of the office. It touches information quality, ownership, access, and decision rights all at once, which means that when something goes wrong, leaders blame the visible thing right in front of them. They point to the prompt, the model, or the user behavior instead of looking at the hidden structure underneath that actually caused the friction. This is why adoption dashboards can be so misleading for a leadership team, as a dashboard can show active users and increasing interactions without proving that decision quality has actually improved. It doesn't tell you if people trust the outputs under pressure or if the AI simply inserted a new verification layer into an already weak workflow. Executives misread the problem because they are often shown activity as proof of transformation, and activity is a very seductive metric for a busy leader. It feels measurable and modern, like real progress is happening, but it ultimately rewards motion rather than alignment. When a rollout is under pressure to justify its own budget, activity becomes the easiest story to tell, even if it hides the fact that the system is struggling. Leadership says they need more adoption, while the people inside the system are screaming for more reliability because the context they are working with is unstable. That gap is where a lot of AI strategy starts going wrong, especially when what gets framed as employee resistance is actually just smart pattern recognition. The people closest to the work are not rejecting innovation, but they are detecting that the system beneath the interface is not coherent enough to support the promises being made. Executives miss that reality because distance tends to smooth out the rough edges of a business, making the organization appear much cleaner than it actually is on the ground. Governance exists on paper and roles seem clear, but the closer you get to the daily work, the more you see the compensating behavior. You start to see the manual corrections, the informal approvals, the duplicated files, and the heavy dependency on specific individuals who hold the whole thing together. That is the operating reality that the AI enters, and if leadership is still thinking in terms of capability while the workforce is living in terms of dependency, they will keep diagnosing the wrong problem. This is also why heavy hype and governance theater often make things worse rather than better. A bigger steering committee cannot repair unclear ownership, and a mandatory usage target cannot create confidence where the underlying information estate keeps producing doubt. The right executive response is not more pressure, but rather a better interpretation of the signals the system is already sending. Leaders need to stop reading weak AI outcomes as isolated tool performance and start seeing them as evidence of deep system dependency. If the business says to scale the AI, but the environment says to verify every single word, the environment is the one telling the truth. The system is not underperforming by accident. It is revealing exactly where the business still relies on ambiguity and human compensation to survive. Once executives see that clearly, the next move becomes obvious. You don't respond with more AI, you respond with structural clarity. Don't respond with more tools. Respond with structural clarity. If we recognize this pattern, we have to accept that the solution isn't another round of tool shopping. It cannot be a search for a better agent, a different workspace, or a new management layer designed to oversee the last one. This reaction happens because software is visible and feels active, allowing leadership to claim they are taking decisive action. But if the underlying problem is actually unclear access, weak ownership, and noisy data, then adding a new tool doesn't solve anything. It just adds one more dependency to an environment that people already find difficult to trust. From a system perspective, this is the moment where organizations need less excitement and much more clarity. And I'm not talking about heavy governance theater or months spent drafting policy language that nobody will ever read. We don't need a giant transformation program that tries to redesign every single process at once. Structural clarity is actually much simpler than that because it just means making a few specific things explicit that the business has been carrying implicitly for years. You have to ask the basic operating questions. What is the trusted source? Who owns it and who should actually have access to it? When you determine what is current and what truly drives a decision forward, you aren't just answering compliance questions. These are fundamental operating questions, and if you answer them well, you'll find that governance improves as a natural side effect. That is why I always resist the instinct to respond to friction by buying more platforms. Most organizations already have more than enough technology to discover where the real issues live. In many cases, Copilot itself is acting as a diagnostic layer by showing you exactly where the system is breaking down. If the answers start to drift, you need to look at the source environment, and if trust drops, you should examine the decision path. When you see people verifying every AI output manually, they are usually compensating for a specific structural ambiguity that hasn't been addressed. The reason for this is simple. You don't need a brand new system to discover that your current one is unclear. You just need the discipline to look at what the machine is surfacing and treat that output as evidence. This shift changes your operating posture completely because you stop asking how to push adoption harder and start asking what the rollout is revealing about how work actually happens. Instead of looking for more things to automate, you look for where interpretation still depends on the same 2 or 3 people. This is a much better executive conversation because it shifts the goal from visible activity to usable coherence. Since AI depends entirely on that coherence, you have to ask what would have to become structurally true before scaling would even be safe. In practice, this doesn't require a massive intervention, but it does require a few very direct moves. You have to make decision-critical information visible and reduce the noise where the truth is competing with digital leftovers. Once you clarify ownership in the domains where AI is expected to help, you can align permissions to actual responsibility rather than historical convenience. Then you test whether the workflow is truly clearer or if it's just moving faster on the surface. This sequence is vital because starting with control frameworks before you understand the friction creates nothing but bureaucracy. However, if you start by observing where AI outputs break trust, you get a practical map of organizational debt that you can actually act on. I think many leaders need to calm down a little bit, not because AI is unimportant, but because the temptation is to overreact in the wrong direction. People tend to lean into either hype or bureaucracy, and both of those are just different forms of avoidance. Hype avoids the structural issue by promising more capability, while bureaucracy hides it behind process language, but neither one fixes the actual condition. Only small structural and repeatable clarity can reduce the interpretation load for the people inside the work. When people no longer have to guess which version of a file matters or whether an answer is safe to use, AI starts becoming useful in the way leaders originally hoped. This doesn't happen magically, it happens architecturally. The right move is never more tools, but rather better definition and less ambient ambiguity. By removing hidden dependencies and cleaning up access, you give the AI something solid to amplify, which leads us to a much simpler sequence of action. Step 1. Expose reality through output testing. If we want to achieve structural clarity, the first move shouldn't be a policy document, but rather a moment of total exposure. We need to let the outputs show us what the environment is actually doing to the data. This matters because most organizations still try to assess AI readiness through a series of comfortable assumptions. They assume the right files are being reached and that ownership is clear, but AI gives us a much better way to put those assumptions to the test. You should start by asking the tool real questions that actually matter to the business right now. Don't use demo questions or friendly prompts designed to make the system look good for a presentation. Use the questions a manager would ask before making a high-stakes decision, or the ones a project lead asks when they are under extreme time pressure. These are the queries that require current context, trusted sources, and very clear boundaries to answer correctly. Once you see the results, you have to ask if the answer reflects the business reality people rely on or if it reveals contradiction and guesswork. I start here because output testing is the fastest way to turn invisible debt into visible evidence. You aren't debating theory or arguing about whether the environment might be messy because you are observing exactly what the machine produces when it touches the environment as it is. If the output references stale material or blends 3 different versions of the same initiative, that is a clear signal. When the AI misses the one document everyone knows is authoritative, or when users immediately open the original files because they don't trust the summary the system is talking to you, the goal isn't to catch the AI making a mistake, but to find where the organization has been relying on human correction to fix structural flaws. I recommend testing across every department, including finance, operations, HR, and sales, rather than staying inside one isolated team. Anywhere the workflow depends on shared context and timely decisions is a candidate for this kind of stress test. Once you compare outputs across these different environments, patterns will emerge very quickly and you'll see where version conflict has become the norm. You will find where access drift has survived organizational changes and where naming conventions are too weak to support quality retrieval. This process doesn't need to become a giant assessment program to be effective. It actually works better when it stays small and practical. Take a set of recurring business questions, ask them through Copilot, and then compare those answers with what the experts in that workflow know to be true. You are looking for 3 specific things: contradiction, incompleteness, and verification behavior. That third one is the most important because trust doesn't just break in the output, it breaks in the user's reaction. If your people consistently double-check, rewrite, or simply ignore what the AI sends back, the system is telling you exactly where confidence has collapsed. That is your map for improvement. Once reality is visible, you are no longer discussing AI in abstract capability terms, but rather discussing where the business cannot yet support reliable synthesis. This gives leaders something real to work with that goes far beyond asking how to write better prompts. You have to ask why one question produces uncertainty in one department while producing total confidence in another. When one team moves forward while another team reopens 5 files to confirm an answer, that gap reveals the structural differences inside your organization. It highlights the differences in ownership, noise, and information hygiene that exist between your teams. Step 1 is simply using the outputs as a diagnostic surface to test what the machine says against what the business knows to be true. Look for the drift, look for the hesitation, and look for the exact point where people stop trusting the path from an answer to an action. Once that reality is visible, you no longer have to guess where the organizational debt lives because the workflow starts showing it to you. And once the system shows you where the friction is, access becomes the next structural lever you can pull to fix it. Step 2, fix access before scale. Once you make your reality visible, the next logical step is cleaning up access. This is usually where organizations start to feel a bit uncomfortable because access mess is almost always tied to history. Think about the old projects that never officially closed or the restructures that left people with ghost permissions. We see old assumptions, temporary access that became permanent, and sites that stayed open simply because shutting them down felt too risky. We've all been in that meeting where someone said, just give everyone access for now, and that now turned into 3 years. That history matters, but we don't need to relive it. We need to fix it because AI is now turning that stagnant history into live operational context. Before Copilot and similar tools, excessive access was just background clutter. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable because humans still had to spend time and effort to actually find anything useful within the mess. Now, the system changes that dynamic entirely. Copilot drastically reduces the friction required to find, summarize, and connect every single thing a person can reach. This means access that once felt like a minor headache is now structurally dangerous. It's not just a security risk, it's a relevance risk. When you give someone too much access, you aren't just increasing exposure, you are increasing noise. And in any high-performing system, noise is poison for decision quality. If the wrong person can see too much, the danger isn't just that they might see something sensitive. The real danger is that irrelevant, outdated content will start shaping their judgment. Old plans, abandoned proposals, and half-finished drafts from 3 managers ago can now enter the answer path of the AI. The output might still sound perfectly coherent, but it's coherent around the wrong context. This is why I frame access cleanup as relevance engineering rather than a boring compliance exercise. The real business question is, who should see what to make better decisions with the least amount of drag? When access matches actual responsibility, the AI has a clean field to work with. But if your access reflects organizational leftovers, the AI simply inherits those leftovers at machine speed. The principle here is simple. You need to audit who can access what and then ask if that access matches their business responsibility today. not the org chart from 2 years ago, and not the project structure from a previous transformation. You have to look at the current reality of who owns what and who actually needs the data. While that sounds basic, it is actually one of the fastest ways to improve both safety and output quality at the same time. Broad access creates two distortions. It widens the blast radius for sensitive data, and it weakens the signal quality for retrieval. Most leaders focus on the first one, but the second one is just as critical for the business. If the machine is pulling from a pool that is noisier than it needs to be, your answer quality will drop even if no secrets are leaked. Access review is answer improvement. It helps the system find what is relevant instead of just what is available. I recommend starting with your high-impact areas such as decision-heavy teams, cross-functional workflows, and executive support environments. These are the functions with sensitive material and fast-moving context where inherited permissions and legacy groups cause the most damage. You need to look for those organization-wide shares that no longer make sense and project spaces that should have been archived years ago. This isn't about making information hard to reach. It's about aligning access with accountability. That is the true meaning of least privilege in an AI world. It's not about having fewer rights, but about having better shaped rights that reflect who should actually act and decide. When you improve this structure, your outputs become quieter and more focused. You see less accidental drift and fewer surprises, which means people spend less time wondering why the AI pulled a random, irrelevant file into view. That is the practical gain you're looking for. Before you try to scale AI across the whole company, fix the access first. If your permissions are still carrying the memory of your past organization, your AI will keep giving you answers for a business that doesn't exist anymore. Step 3. Reduce data noise and clarify ownership. Once you align your access, the next problem becomes impossible to ignore: noise. Even if the right people are looking at the right spaces, the AI still depends on the content inside those spaces being usable. In most organizations, the data environment is a mess of duplicates, old versions, and files that were renamed instead of retired. We see decks copied into new folders rather than maintained at the source, and project sites that act like active memory when they should be archives. The machine simply does what the environment allows, retrieving information from a landscape where the truth is constantly competing with leftovers. When the answer pool is contaminated like this, even the best access controls won't save you. Reducing data noise isn't about being tidy. It's about the fact that ambiguity compounds when a machine tries to synthesize clutter. Humans are actually quite good at working around mess. We recognize familiar file names, we remember which folders are the real ones, and we know that a file named final v3 new is almost never the final version. If the documentation looks wrong, we just message a colleague to verify it. The machine doesn't have that intuition. It only sees retrievable material. So if 5 versions of the same business reality exist, it treats them all as valid candidates. Step 3 is a trust exercise designed to give the machine clearer signals. We need less competing context and much clearer ownership of the information that remains. Start by asking a very practical question. For the decisions that matter most, where is the authoritative source supposed to live? If that answer is fuzzy, your AI will inherit that same fuzziness. You have to reduce duplication, archive the obsolete versions, and stop treating storage as harmless accumulation. In an AI environment, accumulation is no longer passive. It is active context that participates in every answer and affects output quality directly. But noise reduction alone isn't the whole solution. Even a clean environment will fail if nobody actually owns the critical domains inside it. Ownership is what turns information from available into dependable. Someone must be responsible for what counts as current and what needs to be retired when the business changes. Without that, the environment just drifts back into the same old patterns of temporary files becoming permanent references. You need to clarify ownership by information domain rather than just by the platform. Ask yourself who owns the pricing logic, the policy language, or the customer escalation guidance. These are the operational questions that matter more than who technically administers the SharePoint site. AI needs truth ownership far more than it needs technical administration. While structural resilience does require redundancy, it doesn't mean you should have 5 unofficial copies of the same document. Useful redundancy means multiple people can update and validate a domain without creating competing versions of the truth. The goal is a quieter estate with fewer duplicates and explicit ownership. When you remove the interpretive burden from your people, the AI stops blending leftovers and starts reinforcing your actual business logic. The answers become more stable because the environment itself is stable. And in the end, stability is what trust grows from, not just fluency or speed. Once the noise drops and ownership is visible, you can finally look at the workflow itself and ask if AI even belongs there in the first place. Step 4 and 5. Validate decision flows, then reintroduce AI. Now we get to the part most organizations want to skip. They want to clean up a little access, archive a few old files, maybe tighten ownership in a few places, and then go straight back to scaling their AI. But here's the thing. If the workflow itself is weak, Cleaner information alone won't save it. Step 4 is about validating the decision flow before you put AI back into the middle of it. That means asking a very plain question. How does a decision actually move from a signal to a commitment in this part of the business? I'm not asking how the slide says it moves or how the process map looked when it was last approved 3 years ago. I want to know how it really moves today. Who brings the input, who checks the work, and who actually has the authority to decide. You need to find where the exceptions go and where the process slows down because the documented path stops being enough for the team. This matters because AI is often introduced into workflows that were never structurally complete to begin with, and people hope the tool will smooth over the missing parts. If a decision still depends on side conversations, hidden approvals, or one experienced person translating ambiguity into action, then AI is being dropped into a flow that cannot absorb acceleration safely. From a system perspective, that's not augmentation, it's load injection. So validate the flow by taking a real decision path. Maybe it's a customer escalation, an internal approval, a policy interpretation, or even project prioritization. Then walk it end to end. Look for the points where confidence drops and where people leave the documented process to go find a person instead. You are looking for the points where the answer exists, but the authority to act on it does not. Those are the places where AI will appear helpful and still fail to reduce business friction. Once you see that clearly, Step 5 becomes much simpler because you do not reintroduce AI everywhere. You reintroduce it selectively only where context, access, ownership, and decision logic are aligned enough to support it. That is the discipline most rollouts are missing. They treat AI like a layer to spread broadly, but a better approach is to treat it like a capability you place where the operating conditions are strong enough to hold it. This means some workflows are ready sooner than others. Low-risk summarization, document compression where the source set is stable, and preparation tasks where the human still owns the final judgment are often good re-entry points. But high-ambiguity workflows with weak ownership and unstable source truth should not be first in line just because they look important. Importance is not the same as readiness. Actually, the more consequential the workflow, the more structural clarity it needs before AI can help without increasing hidden risk. And this is where measurement needs to change too. Don't measure success by excitement, prompt volume, or how many licenses are active. Measure whether decision latency goes down without trust going down with it. That is the real test. If people can move faster and still feel confident in the path from output to action, then the environment is supporting AI properly. If speed increases but verification loops stay high or confidence remains low, then the system is still telling you the same thing, not ready. That's why I would say this as directly as possible. Don't scale AI, fix the system it depends on. Because once you do that, AI becomes much more useful and much less dramatic. It stops being a hope project and becomes a practical layer inside a workflow that can already stand on its own. And that is the real goal. Not AI as replacement and not AI as theater. We want AI as amplification of a decision path that is already structurally coherent. So the sequence is clear. First, expose reality, then fix access, then reduce noise and clarify ownership. Then validate how decisions actually move. And only then bring AI back into the flow where it can support judgment instead of forcing more of it. And that leaves one final question for leaders. If AI is already showing you how your business really works, are you willing to believe what it reveals? Conclusion. So let me leave you with the real implication. AI will not transform your business by itself. It will show you what your business actually is. It will show you whether your information has hierarchy or just volume, and whether access reflects responsibility or just history. It will reveal whether ownership is explicit or carried silently by a few reliable people. It will show whether your workflows can absorb speed or whether they still depend on manual correction to stay safe. That is why I think this matters so much. Because if your AI is not working the way leadership expected, the most useful response is not disappointment with the tool. It is curiosity about the environment. What is this exposing? Where is trust breaking first? Which decisions still need human translation because the structure beneath them was never made clear enough for a machine to support? That is the executive shift from AI adoption to system integrity, from feature excitement to operational truth, and from rollout momentum to structural resilience. And once you see AI that way, the conversation changes. You stop asking whether the model is impressive and start asking whether the business is coherent enough to benefit from what the model can actually do. That is a much harder question, but it is also the only one that leads to durable value. Because if you look closely, AI is not only a productivity layer, it is an audit surface. It reveals where your organization is clean, where it is noisy, where it is overexposed, where it is under-owned, and where people have been compensating for weak design for years without ever calling it that. And the reason I keep coming back to this is simple. Most businesses do not fail at AI because the models are useless. They fail because the environment underneath the model was never aligned for trustworthy acceleration. It is a system outcome. So if you take one thing from this episode, take this. If your AI isn't working, it's probably not an AI problem. It's a system problem. And that should actually be good news because systems can be observed, they can be clarified, and they can be redesigned. Not perfectly, but enough to reduce noise, improve trust, and lower decision latency where it actually matters. If this changed how you see AI, leave a review for the podcast because that helps more leaders find these conversations. And connect with me on LinkedIn, send me the next topic you want unpacked, and ask yourself one last question. If you audited your AI the same way you audit your systems, what would it reveal?